fait que redire en premier lieu combien nous sommes heureux et fiers d'accueillir ce soir Magnus Ryan, senior lecturer à l'université de Cambridge, professeur invité à l'école des chartes jusqu'au la mi-avril prochain. Alors, Magnus Ryan, je le présente en quelques mots. Il a fait ses études d'histoire à l'université de Cambridge. Il a aussi obtenu son doctorat. C'est un historien du droit, un spécialiste de l'histoire de la pensée médiévale et prémoderne, particulièrement ce qu'on appelle le jus commune médiéval, de l'utilisation dans l'argumentaire politique du droit romain, du droit canonique et surtout peut-être du droit féodal dont il est, droit féodal savant, c'est-à-dire le droit féodal enseigné, dont il est un des rares experts européens, il faut le dire, hein, sinon pratiquement le seul. Je n'ai garde d'oublier que mon illustre prédécesseur, Gérard Jordanengo, était aussi un spécialiste de droit féodal, mais ils sont très rares. Il a abondamment publié, par exemple, sur la pensée politique de Bartol de Sassoferrato, et plus généralement sur les juristes médiévaux. Donc nous allons tous ensemble plonger avec lui dans le monde merveilleux de l'histoire des idées politiques, et plus spécialement dans le monde des juristes médiévaux. Alors je voudrais redire ici, mais finalement c'est peut-être une parole qui n'a pas besoin d'être prononcée avec vous, que ce monde-là n'est pas seulement celui des idées perdues dans le ciel des concepts, mais que si la lecture des juristes nous semble si profitable à maints égards et avec d'autres sources, évidemment, pour tous ceux qui s'intéressent à l'histoire politique de la fin du Moyen Âge, c'est parce que avec les théologiens, avec les artiens, chacun avec leur livre saint, si j'ose dire, hein, c'est-à-dire la Bible pour les théologiens, Aristote pour les artiens et le digeste, et pas seulement le digeste pour les juristes, il s'efforce en quelque sorte, sans grandiloquence peut-être, de penser le monde, du moins la société, les relations entre les individus qui la composent et bien entendu l'organisation politique et l'ordre des pouvoirs. Et ainsi en est-il sans doute de ce que nous allons entendre, que je vais peut-être résumer aussi en quelques mots, hein, selon le résumé qu'en a lui-même effectué Magnus. De quoi allons-nous parler? Tout part du principe que, selon le droit romain, l'empereur avait reçu ses pouvoirs du peuple romain. Et c'est un principe auquel les juristes étaient très attachés, et pour la raison que la plupart des juristes médiévaux avaient admis que l'Empire romain existait toujours comme empire universel pour tous les chrétiens, et que le principe que je viens d'énoncer, que l'empereur avait reçu ses pouvoirs du peuple romain, leur rendait difficile de travailler au service des royaumes, des villes, des principautés, tout pouvoir qui pouvait exiger une justification légale pour partie sur la base de ce principe. C'est ainsi que, ça c'est une affaire bien connue, un des points cruciaux de la théorie politique élaborée dans les années 1200 était que on se débrouillait avec l'idée qu'un souverain qui ne reconnaissait aucun supérieur dans les affaires temporelles était considéré comme empereur sur ses propres termes. Mais cela ne signifiait pas que la relation entre un tel dirigeant et son peuple était analogue à celle du peuple romain et de l'empereur romain. On ne peut ainsi que constater la difficulté, hein, donc à parler du peuple et comme tu l'as dit à plusieurs reprises, le peuple a tendance à disparaître de l'analyse juridique des royaumes et des principautés au cours des XIIIe et XIVe siècles. Alors, la notion de territoire, puisque c'est de cela dont nous allons parler, en tant que partie intégrante de la juridiction ancienne de l'empereur, mais c'est cela dont qu'il faudra développer, devenait un instrument crucial, vital pour les juristes du jus commune qui essaient d'expliquer comment royaume, principauté, cité pouvaient s'insérer ou non dans le cadre contraignant du droit romain. Et la notion servait de preuve, évidemment, mais permettait également, et c'est un des aspects que je crois que tu vas développer aussi, aux juristes qui travaillaient pour les princes de contourner le peuple et d'éviter ainsi d'attribuer au peuple une supériorité sur le souverain. Mais de ces questions-là, je te laisse parler plus amplement et bien mieux que moi. Et donc, à toi la parole.
I must begin by thanking Madame la Directrice for her very kind permission for me to speak in English this evening. I would like to assure you I do not belong to those Anglophone historians who think it is their natural right to speak English everywhere in the world. My French is so bad that it would be academically irresponsible if I attempted to communicate in French this evening. I intend to do something about this in the months and years that follow. I want to thank above all, of course, La Directrice and Patrick for arranging not just this lecture, but the wonderful hospitality of this extraordinary institution. It is a very great honor to be professeur invité à l'École des Chartes for many reasons, but Patrick was kind enough to mention one of them, of course, Professor Gérard Jordan-Ingo, who wrote the most important and the most recent work on the subject of my own thèse d'état, that is Le droit féodal dans le pays de droit écrit, which has been a book of immense significance for me. And Monsieur Jordan-Ingo was kind enough to write several letters to me, and when I was a doctorant, and that was before we had courriel, that was when you had to write a letter, something which people in the École des Chartes should understand, I think. But it is an enormous pleasure and a great honor to be here, so thank you all very much. I will be speaking slowly. For many years, territory has been a fashionable concept among political scientists, international lawyers, and historians. Entities such as multinational companies operate across territories, largely by ignoring them. Governments claim extraterritorial powers and at the same time try to defend their own territories against external interference. Humanitarian organizations and international lawyers debate the legitimacy of interventions in sovereign territories. In all this, territory matters because when it is challenged, sovereignty is also challenged, and therefore the state. And there is a quasi-tautological relationship between the modern sovereign state and sovereign territory. Now, the university-trained lawyers of later medieval Europe were extremely interested in the concept of territorium, which is how they thought of it. In order to understand why their interest is interesting even now, I need to explain to you where my lecture today fits in with my own broad project of research. Like so many of us, I am not writing a book, as it seems. I want to start at the end of the story. By the late 16th century, the Roman law was very obviously a language of politics, a language of political analysis, which was used obviously by lawyers, but by many others too. Polemicists, propagandists, diplomats, theorists generally. One might say there was Aristotle, there was the Bible, there was classical literature, and there was Roman law. That is not an exhaustive description of a post-humanist library, but it's a good description. By this time, the terms and the concepts of Roman law were generally applicable, and that is what permits us to use this metaphor of a political language. The clearest example of that is the body of ideas which we associate with Calvinist political theory, quite often called Calvinist resistance theory, after Saint Barthélemy. So polemicists such as Théodore de Bèze, François Ottman, the anonymous author of Vindiciae contre Tyrannos, insisted on the popular origins of governmental power as an axiom, a general principle of all politics. The rulers of all well-ordered polities were established by their respective subjects, by their peoples. Everything dictated that a proper ruler's governance originated in a popular grant, and that it should remain open to popular scrutiny and control for reasons which were intrinsic to the very nature, the concept of a grant of power. Roman law, of course, contained the most famous example of such a grant of power by a people to its ruler. According to the corpus juris civilis, forgive my English pronunciation of Latin, the corpus juris civilis, the Roman people had famously transferred to the princeps, the emperor, all of its imperium and potestas. In another passage, it's imperium and ius. Now, two important questions I'm exploring in my own principal project relate to the two most striking aspects of this late 16th century discourse: populism and universalism. What happened to the people as a political agent in the legal theory of the later Middle Ages? That's the first question. And the second question is, why did it take so long for Roman law to become this universal authority, which we see in action in the works of the Calvinists and others, including, of course, their Catholic opponents? Now, both questions are particularly interesting for students of medieval law and politics. And to understand why, we need to familiarize ourselves with the main structure, the architecture of political theory in this jus commune tradition. So we are going to lose sight of territory for a few minutes, but patience, courage. Many of you will already know Roman law tells a story, a very strong story, about an empire. And the fundamental difference between the theorists I've mentioned from the late 16th century and the medieval lawyers is that the medieval lawyers took that truth very seriously. They knew they were reading one story about one organization. They did not generalize the story they found in the corpus juris civilis, a story about the origins of the emperor's monarchic power over the Roman people. They did not treat that story as a model or as a paradigm for all government, for all relationships between subjection and government or rule. But that is what we saw the Calvinists doing. And the text I would particularly recommend, if you are curious about the end of the story, is actually Théodore de Bèze's Du droit des magistrats, in particular the Latin version, De jure magistratuum. It is very clear there. The reason that the medieval lawyers were not like late 16th century Calvinists, not one reason they were not like 16th century Calvinists, was that, as Patrick has said in his introduction, the Roman Empire was not an example of anything for medieval lawyers. It was the unique and universal empire, the unique, universal political organization for all Christians. It was not just one example of a general category of political organization. It was the organization which contained all the other organizations. Organizations like kingdoms and cities and principates. Why was that? Well, theologians as far back as St. Jerome had told them that that was true. In his commentary on the book of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar's dream. The Roman Empire was portrayed in those terms by Justinian as well. It was not so much a geopolitical phenomenon anymore. It was an eschatological concept. It would accompany Christ's church until the end of time, until Judgment Day. It's essential to remember that as we now explore how the glossators and the commentators of Roman law interpreted the story of the lex regia, of the transfer of power. The glossators were very interested in this story for one specific reason. From the beginning of the scientific study of Roman law at Bologna in the late 11th century, scholars had encountered a major difficulty in their texts. It related to a question of fundamental importance, especially for lawyers. Who had the power to legislate? Whose law really was the law? Was it the emperor or was it the people? And this is where you may find your dossier helpful. A passage in Justinian's Code, Code 1, 1412, describes the emperor as the sole legislator. On the other hand, Digest 139 states emphatically that the Senate can still legislate, even now. Digest 1332 seems to corroborate that. It explains that laws are only binding because they express the people's consent. If the people should express a contrary will, if the people should change its mind by forming a contradictory custom, a custom which breaks the law, then the law is abrogated. The law is no longer in force. And you have that passage in front of you. So the Senate and the people, on the one hand, seemed to compete with the emperor, on the other hand, for the power to legislate. And the medieval interpreters of Roman law thus had a problem. These are scholastics. Texts do not contradict each other. At least they better not. Now, by the late 12th century, the Bolognese lawyer, king of his generation, Azzo, I believe in French is known as Azzon, with an O, came up with a very sophisticated explanation, which is probably the most important medieval political idea tout court, I would suggest. The emperor, according to Azzo, was indeed sole legislator, but in a very, very specific sense. He was the only single person who, on his own, could make law. Nobody else could do that. But when everybody else was regarded not as single people, as individuals, but as a corporate whole, as something else, as a populus, a collective noun, then they possessed authority superior to that of the emperor. They could legislate, and they could depose the emperor. they could deprive him of his powers. And the way Atso put that was to say that the people had reserved a power of its own at the lex regia. So imperium, potestas, these pass to the emperor, but the people keeps something back. That is the main principle that we find in Théodore de Bèze's du droit des magistrats. Now, this has been taken, that is a very famous story. It's in all the textbooks. And it's been taken by even the best historians of political thought as a sort of proto-republican populist argument, which was intended, supposedly, to justify the self-governance, the autonomy of Italian city-states, especially in those regions of Italy still technically subject to the Holy Roman Empire. I would like to suggest that that is an error. It is wrong to look at Atso's argument in such a way, because Atso was not talking about any political organization except the Roman Empire when he declared that the people had a residual power, when he declared that the people could revoke the lex regia. When Atso discussed other collectivities, such as Italian cities, he deployed very different arguments. He asks, could municipal magistrates legislate, for example? And he must have had Italian cities in mind. That's what everyone meant in the 12th century when they talked about municipal magistrates. They meant the podesta or the consul. And he says that they could, but he doesn't use any lex regia language at all. He doesn't even refer to this earlier argument. In fact, he has to excavate some quite obscure passages from other parts of Roman law in order to show that municipia in the Roman Empire had the right, indeed, they had the duty to legislate for themselves. Another question Atso asked, was the emperor the only person to hold merum imperium? And that is the phrase that matters here. Merum imperium is the quintessence of governmental power in Roman law. Again, he said no. But again, he never mentions the people, let alone the lex regia. Instead, he engages in a minute analysis of some very obscure passages in the Roman law, in the Digest and in the Code, to prove that provincial governors and the praetorian prefect also possess merum imperium. So, to repeat a point I've already made, city-states were not similar to the empire. They were not analogous to the empire. They were not polities like the empire. And of course that word polity did not even exist in Latin when Atso was writing. They were subordinate organizations within the empire. And what was true of the whole empire was not necessarily true of its parts. That is the logical difference, the legal difference between a city such as Florence or Milan and the empire. All the lex regia did in Roman law was explain why at the top of this organization there was now a monarch when there used to be a people. That's all it explains. So the problem for the glossators of the Roman law was that these lesser organizations, like cities and like kingdoms, were now in charge. They were running Europe. The empire was very obviously not. So how could lawyers explain the obvious independence of let us say, the King of France, Philippe Auguste was hardly a model, loyal subject of the Holy Roman Emperors. Yet the Holy Roman Emperor was the legal successor to Justinian. This empire, as Patrick said, was still in existence, and it had to be in existence for many of the lawyers. Not all, but many. Now, the answer is very famous, and it came not from Roman lawyers at all. It came from canon lawyers. One canon lawyer in particular, that is Pope Innocent III. Innocent III explained in a famous letter to Count William III of Montpellier, in his decretal Per Venerabilem, that the King of France acknowledges no superior in temporal matters. Now, the teacher of canon law at Bologna, Alanus Anglicus, I'm delighted to say, declared in another context that, and you have the quotation in your dossier, what has been said of the emperor may be held true of any princeps who has no superior lord. Each one has as much jurisdiction in his kingdom as the emperor in his kingdom, in his empire. Now, that argument must have been known to Azzo amongst the Roman lawyers. Bologna was not very big, because he asked if Philippe Auguste had been right to transfer the allegiance of Arthur, Duke of Brittany, to King John of England. And he argued, and I quote, "Nowadays, kings can do whatever they like." And very significantly, I've not included this on your dossier, Azzo includes the passage from Roman Law Digest 141, which says why the emperor can do what he wants, because of the lex regia. So it looks quite like Azzo is, well, he's playing with the Roman law. What we do get is a sense of passing time, a sense of historical change. The empire is not what it used to be. And that's why nowadays a king can become the emperor in his own kingdom, simply by not recognizing imperial authority above him. Now, the most famous statement of that position was made in the middle of the 13th century by in the works of Jean de Blanneau, the French Burgundian jurist who was teaching at Bologna. And this is a subject which was really pioneered by French scholars. Tortulon was the first, and it was closed off by Robert Feenstra later on. What did Blanneau say? Well, Blanneau argued that the King of France recognized no superior in temporal matters. That was normal by the 1250s. But what followed was not at all normal, because Blanneau demonstrated that a rebel, a baron rebelling against the King of France, was guilty of lèse-majesté in the Roman law sense. And that's a very serious sense. And he said that because the King of France was the emperor in his own kingdom. And with that, we have already reached territory, even though the word has not been mentioned yet. A kingdom is a place. It's not just a place, as any political theorist will tell you, but it is nothing if not a place. Now, that might not seem terribly interesting. In fact, it is very interesting, and the reason becomes clear if you examine the argument about non-recognition of a superior in a bit more detail. This non-recognition principle is significant for what it does not say, what it does not explain? It explains nothing systematic. It does not explain the origin of governmental power. It does not even describe the contents of governmental power, not explicitly. Royal power simply appears, it just emerges as an outcome of two things. The possession of a particular bit of the world, in this case France, and not recognizing the pre-existing authority of the emperor. A king's power thus emerges as nothing more than a geographically circumscribed splinter, I believe the French word is éclat, just a tiny bit of the pre-existing imperial jurisdiction. The king controls France, therefore he controls or possesses the jurisdiction over that area, now called France, which used to be subject to the emperor. It's as if he has the ground, so he also has the grass growing on it, and the grass is jurisdiction. Now, you can see the irony of this immediately. The argument that the King of France recognized no superior in temporal matters was directed, of course, against the modern emperors, the Germans. But it was still dependent on the pre-existing jurisdiction of the empire. This is a parasitic argument. We'll see why in more detail in a few minutes. And we can see it at work in one of the most influential, perhaps, but certainly original bits of jurisprudence from the early 14th century. And this is by another Frenchman, Jean Four, Latinized to Johannes Faber. In his commentary on Justinian's Code, Four discusses at some length the usual questions. These were quite traditional in law faculties by this time. Was the emperor still lord of the world? Was he dominus mundi? Could the emperor be deposed? Were other kingdoms legitimately independent, or were their kings simply usurpers? This was a usual list. Now, Jean Four's views are complicated for us by he was a supporter of the monarchic papacy. Hierocracy renders this a little difficult. But the following comment he makes is clear enough, I think, and you have this in your dossier. You can say that whoever has a territory with long established boundaries is justified by the common law within the limits of that territory, in exercising in whatsoever part of the empire the right which the emperor exercises over the whole. Now you can see what I mean by this being a parasitic argument. The territory is a bit of something older and bigger, which has to exist if the territory is going to do any work, theoretically. It's not what I would call a foundational argument. And we'll see the difference become a little clearer as we go on. Now, Jean's first legal proof in this argument is a passage of great importance, and it's of course from Roman law. It's the passage from the Digest where Roman law defines territorium magnificently from the Latin verb to terrify, terreo. Medieval philosophers were not the first people to invent bad etymological explanations. Very interestingly, however, territory is the, and now we join the text, territory is the universitas of fields within the limits of any city, which they say is derived from the fact that magistrates have the right of terrifying, that is, banishing, within the limits of that place. So Roman law presents territorium as something intrinsically linked to the concept of jurisdiction. At Digest 2:120, it said nobody should obey a judge's decision outside his territory, nor a judge who exceeds his jurisdiction. The two concepts are very closely related. More than anything else, the idea of territory for Jean Faure was a proof. It was an épreuve. And we can see why. If you held a territory, if you controlled a territory defined historically, then you held jurisdiction, because that's what territory is. And that means that all those other interminable arguments about the relationship between the emperor and national kings, about the historical empire, about today's fainéant emperors, they don't concern you. They're not your problem. That's for the teachers and the theorists in Bologna or anywhere else. Jean Faure, of course, was in France. The point is this: if you want a quick and, to quote my own lamentable Prime Minister, robust way of answering these questions, all you need to know is, does this bloke have a territory? Or does the other person have it? And who had it first? It's so simple. But far away in the background, there's still the Roman Empire as the historical source of that jurisdiction which makes a territory what it is. So the territorial argument made it easier to explain why certain people were now rulers rather than other people. In particular, it explained why the emperor was no longer in charge, but somebody else was. It was not an explanation of why the powers which made governmental rule what it was were what they were. That question was simply not available for discussion. And that's one reason why the people as a political agent slowly disappears from view. It sinks under the surface of jurisprudence in this period. We are ignoring, with territory, some very fundamental questions. Where does it all come from in the first place? What's it for? How does it work? No answer. All you need to know is that the person who recognizes no superior and is in charge of this territory is your boss. If we go on to ask the obvious question, what qualified as a territory, then Roman law had at least two answers. One passage implied strongly that any civitas possessed a territory, and that would be useful for lawyers whose task was to justify the pretensions of Italian cities. The second possibility was the Roman law provincia, the province, the area ruled by a provincial governor. And this was much more interesting for the medieval lawyers, because the provincial governor possessed greater imperium than anyone in his province except the emperor himself. That's from Digest 1, 18:4. And if you carefully added up all the prerogatives and the powers mentioned in different bits of the code and the digest of a provincial governor, then the provincial governor looked pretty impressive, actually. It looked like he had, I've mentioned it before, merum imperium. It looked like he had that quintessence of governance. Some lawyers who were better than the rest realized that this was nonsense, of course, that the provincial governor did not have merum imperium, but you can't ask people to be perfect. The principal role of territory in all these discussions was to legitimate and to justify the exercise of governmental power, and that logic led, infallibly, back to the Roman Empire as the source of jurisdiction. And this is the appropriate moment for me to emphasize one of the questions with which I began. It's the question about universalism. this notion of territory did nothing to emancipate the Roman law from the history of the unique and ongoing, and indeed future, Roman Empire. In fact, it depended absolutely on the history of the Roman Empire. Now, these arguments were, of course, intended to insulate kings, particularly, against any legal claims by the rulers of Germany, however improbable those claims might be by this time. But that does not mean that the legal importance of the empire as an abstraction was diminished. And that is why, again and again in these contexts, we encounter references to historical change. That makes no sense if the Roman Empire doesn't matter. It makes perfect sense if the Roman Empire does matter, because you have to do some historical thinking here. It was necessary to explain that the person or the persons in charge had changed. But the nature of being in charge, the nature of governmental power had not changed, because it was the same power which had always been exercised ever since Rome. The rationale of power remained the same in several respects. We've seen one example already in the work of Jean Four, but there are many, many others. In his commentary written, we think, in about 1300 on Justinian's Code, Nicolas de Matarellis attempted to explain why Italian city-states routinely exercised imperial rights of taxation. And his first argument was a reference to the province and historical change. He says that the cities of Italy claim fiscal rights together with the jurisdiction over those rights, which is nowadays, note, nowadays, distributed between cities, just as in the past it was distributed between provinces. So we're getting this association again. Cities, provinces, the exercise of good jurisdiction, the stuff you want, and historical change. But even when other vocabulary was used, not the vocabulary of a province, the legal logic remained the same. In 1380, this is an example I owe to Jacques Crinen in L'Empire du Roi and Sophie Petit-Renaud in Faire loi au royaume de France. They talk about the arguments of the procureur du roi, and following their references, I went to the archive and had a look at the arguments of the Archbishop of Lyon, because that's what's going on here. It's a fascinating idea. The problem was that the Archbishop of Lyon had been confiscating the goods and the possessions of criminals. And the procureur du roi said, that won't do. Only the king can do that, because only the king is emperor in his kingdom. And the procureur of the Archbishop of Lyon, who I think must have been a very good and perhaps slightly brave lawyer, this is in front of Parlement, this is in the plaidoirie, argued that, and for some reason I've given you this in English, I don't know why, it's in your dossier in English, the procureur du roi was not speaking English on July the 18th, 1380, I promise you that. When the laws were made, all jurisdictions pertained to the emperor. Note again, it starts with the emperor. But nowadays, the empire has been divided. And I will interrupt him just to say, he says that in Latin, hodie scissum est imperium. And that is exactly the phrase in Jean Four's commentary on the Code. So interpret that as you like. And the jurisdictions and all high holders of high jurisdiction are reckoned to be the fisc in their own jurisdiction. Well, this is becoming rather complicated. And it's complicated because of the tendency of this word jurisdiction to assume two meanings. We have the technical meaning. Jurisdiction is some kind of power. But then we get the spatial meaning. It comes after a spatial, a locative preposition, in. And that, I don't know about French, but that is an ambiguity preserved in modern English. Jurisdiction can relate to an area as well as a power. So the Archbishop holds fiscal jurisdiction in his jurisdiction, which can only be a geographical or a spatial term. The King of France was already emperor in his own kingdom. The Archbishop of Lyon is now the fisc in his own jurisdiction, and for the same reason, because the empire, these days, has been rent asunder. Schisme, or déchiré, perhaps would be a good word. However, the imperial powers, all of that really worthwhile stuff, imperium, jurisdictio, fiscalia, etc., were the same. They had been, as it were, just left behind when the emperor left. Now, there's more to say about this, but we must move on. The most commonly overlooked and forgotten argument about territory as a justification of contemporary political arrangements is that of Bartolus of Sassoferrato, the most famous medieval lawyer. Now, according to a passage in Justinian's Digest, 119, you have the passage here, all peoples who live by laws and customs are ruled partly by the law of nations, the jus gentium, and partly by their own specific laws. Now, lawyers since the late 13th century routinely took that as Justinian's permission to all cities to legislate, even against Roman law. And their logic was quite simple. Justinian endowed the entire corpus juris civilis with its legal force. Digest 119 is in the corpus juris civilis, and it says peoples can legislate. It also, by the way, goes on to use the word cities, which helps if you're in Italy. A people and a city, they look similar. That means that Justinian's authority stands behind that permission. Now, if we turn to Bartolus, Bartolus began his lecture on this, as every professor had to, by paraphrasing the content of the law. And his paraphrase is significant because it adds something which is not in the law. This is what Bartolus says. It is permitted to every people possessing jurisdiction to enact its own law, which is called civil law. But that which is observed equally by every people is called the law of nations. This is what the text says. Whenever a medieval lawyer says, this is what the text says, you should reach for your pistol. It's the good old sort of Marxist-Leninist reaction about intellectuals, just get the gun out because something's going wrong. And you can see what's gone wrong here. Bartolus has added that phrase, possessing jurisdiction. The word jurisdiction doesn't appear in Digest 119. So Bartolus has greatly restricted the relevance of Digest 119. So if we now ask, as Bartolus wants us to ask, which peoples or cities actually do possess jurisdiction, then he has a very famous answer. A city is a corporate body. It is a universitas. And as he says, there are several categories or grades of universitas, depending on their size. And now we join the quotation on your dossier. One is extensive, which constitutes a province. By the common law, this possesses merum and mixtum imperium. So here we are, we're back with the province. The second universitas is less extensive, which constitutes a city, and according to the common law, only jurisdictions adhere to this over cases up to a certain monetary value, and over the less serious crimes. But they do not have major merum and mixtum imperium. Now, since Bartolus was interested in cities such as Perugia, that was a problem. How could a city gain jurisdiction over the highest and the most valuable power, merum imperium? Now, he offers various possibilities in the passage you have in front of you. He talks about a special or an imperial grant. He mentions the Peace of Constance from 1183, customary usage, or simply de facto possession for a long time. Now, that last category, de facto possession, is the one that really matters, because it covers cities which did not recognize the emperor. And it was for these cities for which Bartolus invented his most original idea. A usurping city, so a usurper, he uses that word, had a de facto, but not a de jure, legitimacy. It's a wonderful legal oxymoron, a de facto legitimacy. Now, that is all very famous. That's why Bartolus is a famous lawyer even now. But his conclusion is never mentioned. Nevertheless, he says, any city possessing a distinct territory which recognizes no superior can be said to be a province. Now, that really is very similar to the kind of argument we've seen in the work of Jean Faure, a generation, maybe half a generation before Bartolus. Now, if we ask now why this territorial argument really matters, there are several answers. One of them is technical. No lawyer of any distinction would allow subjects to become the owners of the jurisdiction which rightfully belonged to their rulers. That was just never going to happen. Even when the ruler was absent for decades at a time, as of course he was in northern Italy, and could not govern effectively. In lawyers' language, subjects were not allowed to prescribe merum imperium. So if you asked the question in those very clear terms, can subjects prescribe merum imperium, the answer was always going to be no. But the concept of territory allowed lawyers a way of avoiding that truth. Territory was a thing. It was a locality, because it was incomprehensible without some concrete substratum. But it was more than just a thing. It's a mixture of thingness and not thingness, if you'll forgive that dreadful neologism. We've seen again and again, territory was defined by jurisdiction, and jurisdiction was what everybody wanted. So if you now return to Bartolus's comments, you see that even a province could be the subject of rights. Look at the grammar. It possesses jurisdiction. So in a rather strange but eminently practical manner, lawyers could justify the claim of an archbishop or a city to governmental powers without having to overcome the impossible obstacle. They didn't need to mention prescription. People like the archbishop could blame it all on history, really, as we saw in the plaidoirie for the Archbishop of Lyon, as well as actually in the argument by Nicolas de Matarellis. That's why sometimes in these arguments we detect a kind of theatrical innocence. The Archbishop of Lyon, or a city in Tuscany, claims to be doing nothing new, nothing unprecedented, when it confiscates the goods of criminals, when it hangs criminals, when it taxes its subjects. This is what government is like. It's what it does. It's as if there is this thing, this quantity lying around all over the ground. If you possess the ground for a long time, then you possess the thing. You are doing nothing new. You're simply using what pertains to the land you control. And in that dialogue between the procureur du roi and the procureur of the Archbishop of Lyon, there's something... As children, we all had these agonizing conversations with our parents. You know, your father says, "Where did you get that?" And you say, "I found it." And you just and you run away in your bedroom and hide. This is what's going on here. It's a way of avoiding the truth, in a sense, and as such, it takes us no closer to the Calvinists. To come back to my anxious question. This is not a step towards a universalizing discourse. As I've said before, this is a discourse which relies upon the historicity and the reality of the Roman Empire, and that is how you interpret Roman law. Roman law is not yet a free-floating, generalized set of norms or principles. Now, the notion that the idea that jurisdiction was somehow in the territory, in the province, was suggested to the lawyers by the rule in Roman law that a provincial governor cannot take his imperium, his power to command, with him when he leaves the province. This is Digest 1, 18.3. He has to be in residence to use his powers. Now, with wonderful literal mindedness, the medieval lawyers thought that meant that the jurisdiction was, as it were, stuck in the ground. It's a bit like trying to move a tree when you leave your garden. You can't, the tree is there, and you don't get the apples. The metaphor runs out, sorry. Now, but much more impressively, what they concluded was that jurisdiction had a real relationship with the province, but a personal relationship with the magistrate of that province, because it cohered with, it is inherent in the res, R-E-S in Latin. Yeah? Fundamental legal distinction, of course, in civil law systems between real and personal actions, real and personal obligations. And this is really the chapter in medieval political theory which has not yet been written. There's a lot of use of this real, or the reality principle, by the medieval lawyers in these contexts. So Baldus Deu Baldis, in the quotation you have in front of you, summed this up very well, and I've chosen just one of 3 possible examples in his writings here, when he says there is a real relation between the jurisdiction and the province and the territory. He also famously said that you must understand jurisdiction to be a bit like fog or a mist, so bouillard, that rises from the ground. But to do that, it needs the power of the sun coming from the top. So what Baldus meant was that a magistrate is appointed by a superior, like a king. But once he's appointed, the jurisdiction is already lying around. It's just waiting for him to use. It's a bit like if I give you the key to the house, you can use the furniture in the house. It's all waiting there. Now, some construction like this sounds rather cynical. It sounds a rather corrupt argument of convenience, but actually it wasn't. In most cases, we must remember, let us take Bartolus again. Cities in northern and central Italy were not arguing against the emperor. They were arguing against one another. And they were arguing against subordinate organizations within their own contadi, something like a castrum, a villa, something like that. And that's the real point, as I've argued elsewhere. That is the real point of Bartolus's theory. It is to justify the exercise of jurisdiction by cities like Perugia against local competitors, local challengers, not the emperor. So Bartolus's argument would be something like this. Not all peoples have jurisdiction, so not all peoples can run their own lives. Those who can have territories, and they're understood to be provinces. And you can prove that fact by looking at the way things have been for a long time. Now, that doesn't sound like terribly impressive normative legal thinking. But I said it's eminently practical. If you take away the empire as a source of dispute settlement, as a source of legitimacy, you are left with a problem which is anarchy. Everybody's claim is as good as everybody else's claim to use imperial powers. And Bartolus's argument is designed to stop that. So these are a couple of quite simple, easy rules. But there was another equally important application of all this, which relates not to cities, but to princely or monarchic rule. It shows a major advantage of the territory argument. Anybody could use it. It did not have to be a governo largo in an Italian city, working by consensual means. Now, death concerns most of us eventually, but it's a very persistent constitutional problem for hereditary monarchies, especially if they are usurpers. After the death of Filippo Maria Visconti in 1447 and a 3-year return to republican government in Milan, the condottiere Francesco Sforza took over the city of Milan and eventually the entire duchy. His ambition then became to secure feudal investiture. He wanted the duchy as a fief from the Emperor Frederick III, which of course is how the Visconti dukes had held it. Frederick III famously refused, and very fortunately, given the damage in the Milanese archives, the instructions survive. I suppose you'd call it a lawyer's brief, survive, for the ambassador whom Francesco Sforza sent to the court of Frederick III. Now, that ambassador was called Sceva da Corte. And Sceva da Corte had, beyond doubt, the worst job in Europe at the time, because he had to persuade the emperor to invest Francesco Sforza, to accept him as his vassal. And Frederick III famously detested Francesco Sforza, and of course never did invest him as his vassal. Now, it's a fascinating document. It was published in the last years of the 19th century in Archivio Storico Lombardo. But the bit I want to mention now is the 7th argument, which Sceva da Corte is permitted to use. And you can see what it says. Basically, Francesco already possesses the duchy. And that means he has the rights of the duke as well. The rights of the duchy are in the territory. And if you look at that phrase in Latin, sic coheret rei, we're back to that reality argument again. In other words, the emperor is not being asked to do anything new. Francesco has these powers. It's as if we have one half of Baldus's comment about fog, but only the first half. It comes from the ground. Above all, however, what really mattered to Francesco Sforza in this context was that he did not have to admit that after Filippo Maria Visconti's death, power had reverted to the people. That argument was never going to work in front of Frederick III. And indeed, in another document to another ambassador, Giovanni Dulessi, Francesco says, if all else fails, tell him we have been elected by the peoples of the cities of Lombardy, but only if all else fails, because he's clearly not going to agree with that. One must imagine Frederick III's horror of that type of argument. He had problems with his own electoral college. Just talk to Eugenius III about that one. De Statu Imperii, etc. So there is a certain amount of cynicism about this, but this is politics after all. But the important thing, as I've said, is that the territory argument, or what I'll call the reality principle, allows lawyers to circumvent, Patrick used the lovely French verb, contourner le peuple. The people are not invited to this particular discussion. Lawyers could avoid them. The people was no longer the repository or the locus of authority. So the Archbishop of Lyon in 1380 did not need to prove that he'd been appointed to rule by some local lex regia carried out by his subjects. And here I think it does matter that Roman law identified territory as a universitas agrorum, a universitas or a corporation of lands, of fields. Because for a medieval lawyer, the natural sense of the word universitas was a group of people, like a guild in a medieval city. Or something like, looking forward, something like le corps du royaume, something like that. And that's what's useful about the territory. It does not intrinsically or inherently imply anything to do with actual human beings, let alone a collective of human beings who could be very dangerous for a certain sort of monarchy. Lawyers who worked for modern kings and princes, even for cities, did not need to derive the ruler's powers from their subjects in the same way that the Roman emperor's powers had come from his subjects. That would have been a major risk, because we've seen where that argument leads. As Azzo, whose argument it was, pointed out, that meant the people could depose the ruler. And that's what made territory such an attractive concept for so many of these people. So, if we revert for the very last time to those questions with which I began, we can see, as it were, that no progress has been made. We are very much, well, some progress. I think it becomes a lot easier to explain why the people as a politically empowered agent slowly disappears from view in a lot of medieval jurisprudence. The real question is, how was that possible? Because the people was a very useful legal idea. It helped when there was no king. It helped when there was an interregnum. That's what corporations were for in 12th century Roman law. To do the owning when there was nobody else to own things. That's what they're still for. Now, that was a very, very useful idea, but of course it was politically extremely dangerous. And the word territory was really rather less dangerous. And the question I suppose I must finish with, and it is a question, is there are other abstractions, and you can see it in Francesco Sforza's instructions to Ceva da Corte, abstractions which might, I suppose, be impersonal, which may have nothing to do with human beings. Then again, they might be personal. That word patria, for example, we find in 14th century chronicles. I'm thinking of John of Hoxham, near Liège, talks about asking the patria for a decision. That means, of course, the estates of Liège. And it's really only since beginning this sort of work that I've begun to ask some actually very obvious questions about what that sort of word means. Think of the metonymy, estate. The primary sense of that was land, territory. We get this very clearly in German with Landschaft. So what French or British historians of the 15th century would always talk about as les états, for the Germans is die Landschaften. But these are people, or they're divisions of people. And yet that word must have had a primary reference to something geographical, something adhering to the soil. So there are many more things to talk about here, but I have spoken enough, and thank you so much for your patience and for your attention. And once again, many, many thanks for having me here at the École des Chartes. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup pour cette conférence à la fois subtile et très dense. Je vais m'effacer rapidement peut-être face aux questions que je suppose vous avez en tête. Je dirais seulement, qui est un propos finalement banal, que les juristes médiévaux assurent toujours un même tour de force, c'est d'essayer de penser le monde qu'ils ont sous les yeux avec des textes, des textes sources qui décrivent en vérité une civilisation disparue, un monde englouti, avec des textes qui sont par nature inactuels, ce qui n'est pas le cas des canonistes, par exemple, qui pensent, eux, avec des textes contemporains. Et d'ailleurs, à ce titre, c'est une parenthèse, le reproche que leur feront les juristes humanistes sur l'histoire du droit romain n'a pas de sens, parce que les juristes médiévaux, tu l'as montré, entre autres choses, ont la perception très nette que les temps ont changé. Ils savent l'épaisseur d'ailleurs de l'histoire du droit romain. Et ce qui subsiste, ça a été dit évidemment à multiples reprises, c'est l'arsenal des mots, c'est la forteresse de mots, comme avait dit le gendre. Et ça suffit assez pour construire une machine à légitimer, voire à délégitimer, si besoin est. Et cette étude de vocabulaire le montre bien. Juste une petite question qui est presque une observation, et ensuite je cède la parole. Sur on en parlait l'autre jour, j'y pensais à propos de la lecture de l'article Tyler Lang sur l'Église. L'évêque n'a pas de territoire. The bishop has no territory. Là, on voit bien le lien territoire-juridiction. Si on prive l'évêque de l'idée qu'il n'a pas de territoire, alors il n'a pas de juridiction. Et ça, c'est pas que de la ratiocination du juriste, puisque, en l'occurrence, dans l'article de Tyler Lang, il montre que c'est les avocats au Parlement de Paris, Jean Lecoq, dans les Questiones, Johannes Galli, qui, le premier, a recueilli cette idée qui a servi évidemment de maturation à la contestation des juridictions ecclésiastiques. Mais, je ne veux pas monopoliser la parole, tu veux dire un mot, bien sûr.
There's of course a whole story to this, which is which relates to canon law. Absolutely. So I'd like to answer what you said last, Patrick, about the territoire of the bishop. It's very interesting because this is one example in which theologians had a very well-defined set of arguments, and this goes back to that famous dispute between the secular regent masters of Paris University in the 13th century and the mendicant friars, the Dominicans and the Franciscans. So Guillaume de Saint-Amour, for example, argues that a bishop's ordinary jurisdiction constitutes his diocese. It is the diocese, it's the jurisdiction. So the papal license to preach and to hear confession given to the Franciscans and the Dominicans violated or compromised the diocese. And of course, Guillaume goes on to argue that because the bishops are the successors to the apostles, a bishop's jurisdiction is created by Christ alone. So the Pope, as Christ's vicar, cannot override, he cannot compromise what Christ has done. So that idea of jurisdiction and territory is very, very strong there. So it makes perfect sense when Tyler says in that article, or when Jean Lecoq argues that a bishop with no diocese can have no jurisdiction, because he leaves the diocese. So there's a theological as well as a legal justification for that. And I was very struck, Patrick, by what you said about what survives is la force des mots, the sort of forteresse des mots. Clearly, legal humanism or legal humanists have a very different idea about historical change. And I suppose that's really defined by Lorenzo Valla when he says that relates above all to words. The words change their sense historically, whereas very strangely in the medieval law that I've read, there is a lively sense that the world changes, but the words don't. The words and the concepts are reliable. They are stable over time. And I think there's more work to be done on what the glossators thought had changed. So they're aware that some institutions no longer exist. If you look at the last 3 books of Justinian's Code, all those terrifying Greek words describing some local tax collector or the dentist to the emperor's horses in the sacred palace. All of this is one word in Greek, of course. It's a mess. Well, they knew these offices did not exist anymore. But I don't think they have a sense of... Indeed, their reconstructions of historical change are often hypothetical, and they are often very ingenious. They're very clever. I don't know why it always seems to be French lawyers tonight, but Guillaume de Ferrière, in a gloss published by, I want to say Edward Moritz Myers. I think it must have been Myers. It's either in the Responsa or in Études d'histoire du droit. Is interested in the consuls, or what they called the capitaux of Toulouse. Capitol of Toulouse, and he's talking about them as if they were a senate, and he's contrasting the real Roman Senate with them, and you get a very subtle differentiation between the institutions, but he's not saying that the words have changed in their sense at all. So it's a very I think it is a tense relationship, as you've imagined, between the world they live in and the text they use, but they trust some things in the text. They trust the words to stay the same. It's the institutions which change, I think, for them. Philly.
Wait a minute.
He's a very nice Italian student who comes to my seminar, and there's no way he can stop, so I'm going to do the same. Now, this is absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much. I have one small question on the question by Adze, because I had a look at it in the edition by Ullmann. And is it a comment about the attitude of the lawyers around Philip Augustus, or is it what he says?
Shall I answer you as you go along?
No, yes,
okay,
please
right.
do, yeah.
It's a fascinating document. It's in a quaestio disputata. So Atzo asked the question, and you have the whole paragraph there.
And that's an addition, isn't it, or is it?
No, it's
was it the question?
It is in Atzo's standard collection of quaestiones disputatae, and it exists in many manuscripts. And so it's not a piece of textual commentary at all. It's an exercise for Atzo's most advanced students. So he gave one student the job of arguing pro, and another student the job of arguing contra. And then Atzo's job was to write it all down and then provide a solution. And we have these quaestiones disputatae because university statutes were just beginning to be promulgated, and a lot of them are to do with the professor's obligation to hold these disputations once a year, and then make sure a written copy arrives at the stationarius, so that pupils could copy it. And what's interesting, you see, this is what Walter. So I'm from Cambridge. I think of Walter Ullmann because he was in Cambridge. Of course, it's Walter Ullmann. But what Walter Ullmann always got wrong, well, he got lots wrong, but he forgot one very important thing, which is this comment by Atzo is in the contra. And Atzo agrees with the other side of the argument. He agrees with the pro. So whatever else, Atzo didn't think that. But it has evidential value because it shows that that argument was normal in Bologna sometime after 1208. We think the dispute has to be after 1208. So it's not an additional gloss. Very strangely also, that question is never quoted by later lawyers. And even though we have all of these manuscripts to show that people were using it, it's never mentioned, which is strange.
Now, I'll just ask one other question. I was joking about the 7 questions.
That's a pity.
It's about Aquinas, because there's such a connection between the way he thinks of provincia and as well. I'm not sure. Does he talks about jurisdiction in the De Regno when he talks about provinces, cities, and so on? Since provinces are like kingdoms, they are perfect entities because they are very balanced, and you're going to have everything, including self-defense. But I'm not sure. I can't remember whether he talks actually about jurisdiction. I was wondering whether you have a connection between the law and Aquinas.
On the whole, my experience is that the Roman lawyers don't really notice Aquinas until the generation of Albericus de Rosate. So we're talking 1340s, 50s, and 60s.
And the other way around? You don't think there's any...
Well, Aquinas does, of course, quote a little bit of Roman law every now and again. It's not... He doesn't seem to be quoting it in the same sense as the glossators understood it. Canon lawyers first started using Aquinas in depth in the 1340s in surprisingly in Paris, actually, because there wasn't supposed to be any canon law taught in Paris, but or not much. So we have Henri de Bouic uses the schema of the secunda secundae systematically. It's quite remarkable. But no, your comment about your question about the provincia, my recollection of Aquinas in the De Regno is that doesn't he think provinces are part of kingdoms?
No, I think he quite. I mean, Jean-Philippe Jeunet, who's just in front of me, might remember as well. Yeah, I think he says provinces or
Does he?
kingdom.
That's fascinating. Thank you very much. That is why one comes to give a seminar at the École des Chartes. I will check that. Thank you. Because that would, yes, I can see that would imply, with an Aristotelian idea of the communitas perfecta, something which contains jurisdiction in itself, wouldn't it? And that's very interesting. I'll check that. But as far as an influence on the lawyers is concerned, I think we can rule that out until Albericus. It's Albericus, for example, who quotes Jean Quidor at great length, and also Dante in the Monarchia, and he uses a lot of Aquinas. But thank you for that. I will check, because as you say, one wonders where Aquinas got the idea of calling a perfect community a province. And if it's to do, the obvious answer would be jurisdiction, wouldn't it? Yeah. So I'll try that. Thank you.
And Giles of Rome, because takes
yes.
I may follow with another question, another topic, because you seem to oppose the lawyers being interested in leaving aside the lex regia, but in some other circumstances they did use lex regia, and they did use it, for instance, when they were discussing the possibility of limiting the power of the prince, or in fact not limiting the power of the prince, but bringing the prince to obey the law, not to behave himself as a princeps legibus solutus, which was also, I think, an important preoccupation for medieval lawyers. Well, lawyers obviously could say anything in one sense and the other one. As Frederick the Great said, if you have a good lawyer, you can do what you want. A good lawyer will justify it either way, so no problem. But I think a good example of that preoccupation is given by Sergeant Fortescue, who is not a Roman lawyer, but who knows Roman law, who uses it, and who is a reader of Aquinas also. So he knows everything. And in his governance of England, he renews, in fact, the myth of the lex regia, because he says at the start that when he came to England, King Brutus was the leader of a fellowship, and this is that fellowship who gave him the power on the land. And therefore he was, obviously the idea of Fortescue was to justify the power, maybe not of the parliament, but maybe of a council, which was more in his ideas than a parliament. But I think this theme becomes important in the 15th century, and we could find equivalent of it in other countries. In Castilla and in the Cortes, there are many evocation of this, and obviously in France too, in the Estates General in 1484, we find some ideas which remind us that of the importance of these topics. I wonder if you could perhaps...
I was... It's fascinating, but we don't yet have what I would think of as a jus commune narrative for the 15th century. It's the black hole. It's a huge gap. You have to go back to, and for an insider legal historian, You have to go back to Urliak before you get a real story about the jus commune and politics in the 15th century. And of course, that's all about conciliarism, so he misses a lot. You're absolutely right. The 15th century, in my opinion, is when everything changes. And if I'd been giving another early version of a different chapter of the book I'm trying to write, it would be about this, and precisely the tendencies you've mentioned. It seems to me that these generalizing attitudes begin in the 15th century. And people like Fortescue, I mean, of course, he knew loads of Roman law, you're absolutely right. And English judges by his time did. They knew plenty. And it's very significant, it seems to me. I've got one example, which, if I may, I'll recall. In 1409, Padua became part of Venice, effectively. You know, the terra firma empire was being established. And about 25 years later, I think it was 1432, one of the very best Italian lawyers of his generation, a pupil of Baldus called Paulus de Castro, was asked for a professional opinion by Padua because Padua wanted to renew its statutes, as these cities periodically did, you know, renovatio statutorum. And Paulus was asked, look, do we need the permission of Venice to do this? Or can we do it ourselves? And he said, you need Venice's permission. And he quoted the Lex Regia at them. He said, you have done this. And he quoted Digest 141. You have submitted, you have handed over imperium and potestas, and you can't have it back. So right at the beginning of the 15th century, we can say, now, clearly, Padua is not the Roman people, and Venice is not the Roman Empire. This is a very exciting text, I think. I'm very excited by this text. I've known about it for years, but it's a question of where to fit it in a story. And what's so fascinating is that in his exegesis, in his commentary, Paulus de Castro sticks to the original Roman historical Lex Regia. When he asks, can the Roman people revoke it? He says no, because of Christ's advent. This is the argument which became common in the 14th century. Hierocracy gets into the Roman law faculties. But he's talking there about, now, that's the original historical Lex Regia. And he is very doctrinaire about that. So in the same lawyer is teaching an orthodox version of the Lex Regia, which is it happened a very long time ago and it cannot be changed. And he's also saying that that's what happens every time a city submits to a foreign lord or even its own lord. So it's becoming a usable tool. And yes, it's certainly being used. It's certainly being used in the manner you described, to keep a ruler ruling legally. Very briefly, finally, one of the key figures here, who is a mystery to me, is Jean de Talvermeil, because I think he's terrified by the Lex Regia, because he won't allow it to be used against, the king. But all of his argument dictates that he should talk about the Lex Regia. So, and again, it's that generation, early 15th century.
Ensemble, pour les juristes français qui veulent en quelque sorte sauver l'idée qu'il y a eu une apparence de transfert, le moyen pour certains, déjà au XVe siècle, mais surtout au XVIe siècle, c'est de dire que le transfert a été fait en France envers une lignée, la lignée des rois de France, une fois pour toutes en quelque sorte. Parce que la lex regia supposait aussi que on était dans un contexte de monarchie élective plutôt que de... et c'est pour cela qu'on disait que les Germains étaient plus adaptés à la monarchie élective. Mais en France, on aurait ainsi choisi une lignée. Et ce qui a fini, on en parlait ensemble, par l'assimilation forcée, mais qui existe chez certains juristes plus nettement au XVIe siècle, entre la lex regia et la loi salique. C'est la loi salique qui, originellement, de surcroît, on pouvait la considérer à la fois comme une loi et puis comme une coutume. C'était une assemblée de grands à l'époque de Clovis. Et elle avait opéré ce transfert une bonne fois pour toutes. Elle avait permis de choisir une lignée et en même temps, elle avait fixé les règles de la succession, puisque c'est à cela qu'elle avait servi. Mais cette idée est forcée. Et de notre côté, les juristes, les bons juristes de l'école ont toujours considéré, même les Français, que la loi salique était, ils le savaient bien, était une forgerie, et qu'ils en étaient toujours méfiants. Rien ne justifiait, ni dans le droit féodal, ni dans le droit romain, ni dans le droit canonique, que les femmes fussent exclues de la succession royale française. Ils le savaient bien. Mais ça permettait sans doute peut-être cette assimilation. Chez Jean Ferraud, au XVIe siècle, elle l'est. Lex regia égale lex salica.
This idea that the original election or the original transfer of power was to a dynasty. I mean, that turns up very strongly in François Othman's Franco-Gallia, yeah, doesn't it? Yeah, of course, who then published 2/3 of de Terre-Vermeille. I'm trying to see if there are any medieval examples of this in the legal tradition of the jus commune, and I think there are, actually. In the Concilia of Aldradus, there's a very interesting, well, we'll talk about it in the seminar when we do the next one, on how primogeniture became established, because Roman lawyers would not like primogeniture. It's very unfair, and Roman inheritance law, on the whole, prefers people to get their fair share. And Aldradus begins by saying that for public utility, it was first necessary to choose a dynasty, and then within that dynasty, to have a rule which established who would get the kingdom. And that idea of choosing the dynasty goes back to, I cannot remember the exact passage. It's a passage in Gratian's Decretum in the second part, so one of the causae. The incipit is Moises, so Moses. So you can look it up in Friedberg's edition, which is about succession of the chosen people, of course, being decided not by blood, but by the living. And the glossators from Johannes Teutonicus onwards are experimenting with this idea of choosing a dynasty. It's not a hugely important idea for them, but they are interested in it. What else was I going to say? Oh yeah, sorry, there's another thing about this. So if we go back to real right and real jurisdiction or personal, one of the big distinctions that the lawyers make is whether, or a question they ask is a hereditary ruler more dignified than an elective ruler. And they're saying the hereditary ruler is because he has real right. He has a real jurisdiction, not a personal jurisdiction as well. So that just came to my mind. But no, yeah, that use of lex regia to cover la loi salique is quite remarkable, isn't it? I mean, and that does not have any, I mean, as far as I'm aware, I don't think it has even a 15th century antecedents. I don't think any medieval lawyer could have said that. It's a very big difference between what's possible in the 16th century and what's possible in the 15th century. It's a very strange argument, isn't it? Yes, sorry, yeah.
Thank you very much for a wonderful seminar. I would like to go back to words remain the same. And I'm wondering, and maybe this links to what we've just said about the 15th century, is this because they're using Latin, Latin being more rigid as a language, and therefore, and the second part of the question is, was there a change when the vernaculars were being used?
Well, the scholastics and the humanists are looking at the same Latin words, and the humanists are clearly operating with a much more relativist historical filter. So that is an absolute difference in mentality. It's what we mean when I think we talk about humanists in a legal context, that they no longer trust the Latin words. Now, the stability of Latin in the scholastic curriculum, and it's partly created by the scholastic curriculum. We have professional scribes, university statutes, which make sure the texts are reliable. Think of the Paris Bibles, in the 13th century. That certainly plays a role. But I think the really interesting point is the third point you made about the vernacular, because what is a historian of law and politics to do with this idea of sovereignty, for example? Now, I mean, one of the books I most revere and admire is Joseph Canning's study of the political thought of Baldus Deubaldis. Now, Joe, who's a very good friend of mine, Joe will always refer to sovereignty in a 14th century context. He'll talk about merum imperium as sovereignty, and he'll talk about the sovereignty of Italian city-states. Now, this might be a problem if you are being a bit pedantic, if you say that, look, until Baudin, sovereignty means something different, so don't use the word. You could say that. That's what my colleagues in the Cambridge School might say, actually, with sort of context and everything. But the real problem is that souveraineté meant something very different in the vernacular, in legal context. If you read Beaumanoir, souveraineté does not mean merum imperium. It's something which every baron, chacun seigneur est souverain en sa baronnie, and then et le roi est souverain partout, something like that. Well, that's the whole thing that sovereignty was meant to get rid of in Baudin. That's why he has it, it's to stop that. So the vernacular does play a major role. I don't think it challenges medieval Roman lawyers' understandings of the Latin they are reading. I have a slight problem with concepts before the vocabulary, but the difficulty is they are sometimes having to translate, and of course, very obviously, in court. So when you read these plaidoiries, you are not often going to encounter the expression Merum imperium. Of course it's there, it is used. But the really important words are things like sovereignty, or superiorité, there's another one. What does and you do find this in the Latin documents, in the pleadings in André Vittoria and I know about all this. In Avignon, for example, when local, originally vernacular difficulties had to be put into Latin. You know, you could not do what you did in the Parlement de Paris. You couldn't have it all in French. Because these are papal advocates involved. These are the best lawyers in the world at the time. Certainly the most expensive lawyers. So everything's got to be put into Latin. And that's where this word superioritas becomes a real problem. And they're arguing about it, what it actually means. And it's not the same as merum imperium. So the vernacular does play a role, particularly when it is Latinized, I think. And then they are having a problem, and then I'm absolutely with you, the concepts do look rather vulnerable suddenly. Because they're trying to make one world, or one linguistic world, speak to another. Again, a longer version of this paper would have included some material from a case which Andrea and I have both been working on over the years, which was originally put forward by Peter Linehan. It's an absolutely fascinating case about episcopal and royal jurisdiction in Braga. And that word superioritas is a real problem. Real problem.
Thanks a lot for this beautiful lecture. It was fascinating, and a beautiful chapter about the building of the modern state. I have to say first that I'm not a pure legal historian. I'm in public law. I'm a professor of public law. So my questions will be very likely a bit naive. Sorry. I was interested a few weeks ago about the relationship between the territorial sovereignty historically and the oath of allegiance. And at first I was interested about this debate between James I and Bellarmine, you know, the Cardinal Bellarmine, in the first years of the 17th century. And so my question is, did you find a bit of this relationship between territorial sovereignty and the need of an oath of allegiance in this period you studied?
Don't think so. Sorry, I am rapidly trying to remember everything I've read ever to answer that question. Thank you. Let me see. Do I think about that? Oath, territorial. I think I have not, but there's half an answer, which is that I think Paul Brand does know the answer to that question because he's written about it. It's just occurred to me, but I can't remember what he says. But there's nothing I can find so clearly about this as, for example, Cook's arguments about that, which I have read recently and which are indeed fascinating. If anything occurs, I will let you know. But at the moment, no, I don't think so.
And I find this aspect quite interesting because in what you said, at least for a public lawyer as me, there is a sort of uncertainty about the true order of the sovereign power. Because you said at the background there was still the Roman Empire, and so I mean for the modern public theory, we don't know exactly who is the sovereign. Is it the emperor? Is it the city? Right. And so on. So, but if you introduce this element of an oath of allegiance, you have to say the sovereign is someone is, and so sovereignty is at least power over people. After the 16th century, there was this need to ask people to take an oath of allegiance. And so there is a subjective aspect of sovereignty.
I'd never thought of it like that. That's really interesting, isn't it? When you take an oath, your point is that when you take an oath, you are rather being forced to make a decision about who the sovereign is, aren't you? Because you're taking an oath to a person. Yes, I see that. And I can also see why that would have a territorial aspect, actually, because this is not just a matter of a vassal's oath, and it never had been. If you go back to the 12th century feudal law, as we call it, the libri feudalorum, there's already a distinction by 1158 between the type of oath which a vassal swears and the type of oath which a subject swears. And I know that certainly, again, it's a 15th century tendency. And I'd have to restrict my comments to England here, because the doctorate I read, who was devoted to English sources about this, is an interesting work. When people were said to be in the allegiance of the English king, I can't quote any passages, but it's absolutely clear that that often meant in England. That if you were in England, you had in a certain sense to be in the allegiance of the English king. I don't know where I would look to find out more, but that's a very interesting question. I mean, can anyone tell me here, I mean, is there any geographical implication when in a French document one reads about somebody being dans la foi du roi? Yeah, there's that, and that's so. Yeah, and Cutler on treason did a lot of good work on that, and there's a. But the precise relationship with an oath is what this question's about, and that I think is very interesting. I've got no idea. I think it's well worth thinking about. I mean, in my sources, which I admit are limited, in the end one has to choose. I can't think of anything like that, but I've not looked at the 15th century properly yet, and I've not actually looked beyond what Cutler and Bellamy wrote about the problem of Normandy in the 15th century, which was, of course, a territorial problem. And that's why I mentioned Paul Brand, because he has been working on that. Cutler, in his book Treason Trials in Later Medieval France, has got some very powerful examples of a territorial argument being employed by both sides, by Parlement, when it was in pretty much Burgundian hands, and then later on by Charles VII. So there's certainly a territorial argument going on there, and I suspect it is to do with foi, faith, because we're dealing with an idea about treason here, which still maintains some of its non-Roman complexion or constituents. It is about violation of an oath in the sense of felony or felony. So I think that would be the place to go. I will try to look at Cutler tomorrow. Thank you very much for that. It's a very interesting idea.